All right, so our food for thought speaker this evening is Michael Hughes. He is the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer for the Frederick County Government. Long before what has now become fashionable, Michael Hughes, Frederick County's first Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, was instituting racial and social justice initiatives at several large community serving institutions, committing decades towards advancing equity and creating welcoming workplaces and communities. Michael joined the Frederick County Government in November 2020 as a credentialed diversity trainer who is certified in diversity and intercultural competence from Wake Forest University and is certified as a civil rights investigator. He has designed professional development courses for conferences, colleges, corporations, and community serving agencies. His work in advancing social justice is not limited to racial equity training. During his 25 years of progressive advancement in higher education, Michael led Title IX policy design and program launches for multiple colleges to identify and remedy inequities around gender and gender identity, led a cross-functional team in producing the 5-year web accessibility plan to make campus accessible to faculty and students that are differently abled, designed and implemented a restorative justice model for student conduct efforts for a college that adjudicated over 500 student conduct cases each year. He has chaired diversity, equity, and inclusion committees at multiple institutions, provided the services of an ombudsperson, and conducted numerous investigations of complaints of discrimination. While focusing efforts upon the critical work of creating and leading institutional and systemic change, Michael expresses that he never wants to forget the real reason for pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion. He maintains that the simple truth learned in his theological training to, quote, love people and love the God who made them, end quote, keeps him grounded and connected to the why that drives his efforts as the county's Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer. Upon accepting the enormous responsibility for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the county, Michael immediately began identifying and partnering with those that had been doing the work in the county long before he relocated here from North Carolina this past November. These included leaders from community service and support agencies and the faith community, minority business owners, Frederick County public school leaders, and higher education administrators, and others. Michael expresses his gratitude to have the opportunity to participate in this speaker series and looks forward to future opportunities for partnership in the work of making Frederick County a more diverse, inclusive, and welcoming community for all. So we are so pleased to welcome Mr. Michael Hughes as our speaker this evening. And I think he's going to go ahead and share his screen. They're still muted though.
Okay, the mute is fixed. I thought we had left the screen up actually. So let me determine. Okay. Is it possible that my administrative rights are gone as well? Because I don't see the same option to share.
It should not, because I don't have.
Oh, here we, hold on. Let's see if this will do.
There you go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to join with you guys for a few minutes this evening. And I've asked Megan to give me a 7-minute and a 3-minute heads up. So if she jumps in and interrupts me, she is not being rude. She's helping me out. So Megan, thank you for helping keep me on track that way. But I've been looking forward to spending time with you since several months ago when Megan and I spoke about this. You know, I love talking about this because it's dear to my heart, and I think it really makes a difference. I wanted to start with this illustration from Rockwell. As we are aware, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, that legislation made it illegal to have desegregated schools. And this illustration was done in 1964, 10 years later. It took that long even for this to happen, and this was a big moment. It wasn't like that this represented all integration in schools were in place, and there were no more segregation and no more challenges, no more issues, and everyone went away happy. That wasn't the case, unfortunately. But the reality is there's so much around this issue that sometimes we just can't believe that it's still true, that we're still struggling with our race problems, with our race issues. It's a topic that most people don't want to talk about, um, but I like talking about it because I think that's how we get there. I think it's critical. If we don't talk, we don't get there. I'm old enough to remember that to being raised, somehow or another, I picked it up. I guess my parents may have told me, two things you don't talk about in public: politics and religion. But race, you don't talk about that, you don't talk about that, you don't talk about that, you better not talk about that. Please don't talk about race. That's how deeply buried it is and how forbidden a subject it is. So I think that's why we look today and can't hardly believe that we are not where we should be when we consider where all the things we've done to make things right, and yet we still are not there. Uh, this race problem that we have, if I remember the Rocky movies when they came out, and Rocky was not a good boxer. Rocky was a terrible boxer, and I don't remember if Rocky was like 14 of them, maybe. I can only remember one. I probably saw about three of them. But the thing about Rocky, he was fighting, the big fight. He was fighting against Apollo Creed, and Apollo was this great boxer, supposed to be like the Muhammad Ali, I think. And Rocky was not a real good boxer. But the thing about Rocky is that he would stay in the fight no matter what. I mean, he would take the blows, he would take the hits on and on, 15 rounds. He'd get knocked down, get back up. He just wouldn't stop. He would just keep coming at you. And that's the way our race problem seems to be. It seems to be relentless and having that staying power because we've done so much to get rid of this, and yet still we're still struggling with it. But not only does it have staying power, it's got a way of being very crafty and elusive. Um, Hiding in the shadows sometimes, presenting itself in different ways, hard to identify. Sometimes I might have an experience and say, that didn't feel right with somebody, but I don't know what it was. Maybe that had nothing to do with race. I don't know. Because sometimes race and race problems can be crafty and elusive. But not only that, but beyond that, this whole matter seems to spread like a contagion sometimes. And so with us, some of what we try to do with some of the mandates, I work for the county, and so the county issues a mask mandate sometimes with the idea is let's stop spreading this. If we can contain it, maybe we can kill it and stop spreading it. But our race problem seems to be one is once we think we've got it contained, once we think we've knocked it out, once we think we've identified its elusive nature, know what to do with it, it still seems to find a way to spread sometimes on us. And the thing is, it's amazing that we still have this problem. If you consider back in the 19th century, in the 1860s, these Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment to abolish slavery, for voting rights, so your right to vote, all these things were established. Citizenship, all these things should have taken care of it. You would think. I mean, after all, that's what the legislation is designed to do. And that was 160 years ago almost, we're talking about. And yet still, we're still struggling and dealing with this. Because not only as soon as those laws were passed, within a couple of decades, you had the unfortunate case of Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the case that legalized segregation. So you had all these things, this legislation that was passed that was supposed to begin making things right. And very, very soon after that, the courts went back and said, no, we're going to separate people. And it wasn't just about separation, really, was it? There's something else to that beyond separation, which is another conversation to be had. So we witnessed that. Well, that was witnessed in the 19th century. We weren't old enough to witness that, but that was witnessed at that time. And during that century as well, you had different ways to keep people from being able to vote. In other words, they have a right to vote, and then let's find ways, the poll tax and grandfather clause and all these things that keeps folks from voting. That picture in the bottom left corner, you may recognize that's young Emmett Till. And I'm sure that you've heard the story about that, and I won't show the image here, but that's an image that needs to be seen. And I won't even go into details of that, of what happened, but Google sometimes Emmett Till if you have no familiarity with it. And then on the far right at the bottom, that was the crossing of the Pettus Bridge. And you can see the gentleman in the front right corner, that's Congressman John Lewis, who recently died. I had the privilege of spending a day, well, not a full day, a half a day with him, one-on-one. And it was, well, not the whole day was one-on-one, but that was a privilege to be able to meet the man that helped make some of these things happen. And all that's happened to him way back then. And I believe he passed away in 2019, I believe it was, all the way up to that time. And still, despite the fact that folks like him, black and white, stood up and took the billy clubs, took the fire hoses, did all those things. And yet still we are not where we need to be, not where we want to be, I don't think. And so in the 20th century, 1960s this time. In other words, we were in the 1860s before. Now in the 19th century, 16th, excuse me, the 1960s, Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968. 100 years later, having to pass these same laws. And yet still, here we are fighting again about voting, fighting again about fair housing. All the cases of discrimination being reported and investigated and folks being found guilty on many occasions of those things. We still have a problem that we really shouldn't have. And I think we all would agree to that. We really shouldn't be having the problem around race that we are having. And beyond that, so you've got the laws, also corporations, fines levied against them on a regular basis, sometimes more frequent than others, and sometimes more often in certain industries, such as banking, where there may be unfair lending practices, hiring practices, promotion practices, and they shell out millions of dollars and millions of dollars. And yet at the same time, it seems like some of these places, and I won't name them, I've got a few in mind, just they don't change their practices. They just seem to set aside money to pay it out when it happens. And beyond that, so you've got the law, you've got the fines levied by the courts against corporations. And then so we say, well, the law can't seem to fix it. Money doesn't seem to fix it. You know, usually you think when folk have to pay money, they change. Doesn't necessarily work that way. So what do we do next? We're going to train folks. We're going to give sensitivity training. We do that. And we might need to add diversity training in there as well. And what the heck, unconscious bias training. And while we're at it, we're going to hire some folks to be chief diversity officers and things like that. So in other words, we approach it to say, maybe if we train people, maybe if we provide the training, that's the missing piece. And then everything will change, because once people know, ta-da, everything is taken care of and done. But beyond that, when things do happen, and this is a speech I hear more often than any of us want to hear. Someone gets caught doing racist things, to be honest with you. And here's the speech. I apologize for anyone that may have been offended by what I did or what I said, but that's not who I am. You know, it's like when they put the mic up, they can turn his mic off, and I can guarantee you, I can tell you exactly what this person is going to say. That's the speech you give. So you got the law, you've got money, you've got training, and you got shame. Because it's kind of like, it used to be, you know, maybe folks would get shamed and embarrassed, and, you know, you don't want that to happen, but I guess that's not too bad. Just give the speech and keep it moving. Well, you know, like I said, the law doesn't do it. Shame doesn't do it. Money's supposed to talk, doesn't do it. And this happens to be a diversity training I was conducting one day, probably at least. Folks just fall asleep. You know, you do the training and folks are really not that into it. They fall asleep on you. So, you know, the training doesn't work. So all these things, right? These things really we shouldn't be here, because we've done great things to not be here. And yet, you know, we're fighting on a regular basis about these things that to me, there's things that I can see why folks might disagree. Then there's other things I'm like, I can't believe we're still fighting about these things, but here we are. And I think there's several reasons why, in my mind, is that the problem has been severely minimized, uh, you know, to the degree. It wasn't that bad. Like I've heard, just when I hear this kind of thing, I just shake my head. Slavery wasn't that bad. I mean, they fed them, they clothed them, you know, they provided them with health care. It wasn't that bad. I even have heard some state senators, I can't remember, I think it was a gentleman from Arkansas several years ago, and someone else did it as well, but said slavery was really a blessing in disguise for Black people. I'm thinking that was one heck of a disguise, right? Because if you realize the degree of it, the degree of that experience, you never would say that. And then the length of it, we're not taking it seriously if we don't realize we're talking about hundreds of years. And wait a minute, if we isolate it, if we kind of snapshot it, it looks like it's not that bad, maybe, because look, that one thing, okay, well, that wasn't good, but the degree of it, the length of it, the pervasiveness of it all, pervasive, and it infects, like the housing and education and healthcare and everything you can think of, income, uh, residential segregation, everything, widespread acceptance of its beliefs. Sometimes I think we think that there's just one bad apple in the bunch, and if we can marginalize bad apple over here, then it won't be that bad because it's really is not that widespread. And then I think we don't realize the institutional nature of it all. And sometimes I wonder if we don't want to realize that. uh, I think we would make it easier for us if we could say the bad apple guy or lady over here instead of realizing, no, it's a system issue. That's really what we're dealing with, because otherwise we just keep, in other words, this is the tree, not the apple. We just keep plucking the bad apples off the tree and leave the tree standing to continue to produce bad apples. And then the continuity in it, understanding it from beginning to end. Like when you sit down and get the whole story, like if you maybe, I wish that I tried it and it wasn't successful, and that's another story. My dear grandmother, who I love dearly, I remember sitting down with her and asking her to tell me about her story, and she didn't want to talk about it, and I later on understood why. But if I could understand the continuity of my family, that would probably put me in a certain context. I understand my life today if I can understand my generations and generations ago. Understanding the continuity of things goes a long way. We got to come to grip with this though. Understand what we're dealing with. And there's several things to help us to do that. So I've talked about, what I believe the problem is and, the reasons for the problems, but I want to take a moment now to talk about what we need to do, because I'm not giving up on it. I'm not giving up on it. There's a lot of good work still to be done. There are people in the fight, more people in the fight than probably there have ever been. And I'm excited about that. But we still need to figure out how we want to do this. How do we do this? And one of the things, I'm one of those folks that wants to be a historian. I'm a wannabe historian because I've understood the value of history. And I think all of us, when we think about it, realize that, you go to college, and no matter what you studied in college, you have to take the history of fill in the blank. So for me, it was I was a broadcasting major, so we had to study the history of broadcasting. And I remember, I thought I was going to remember the professor's name, but I can still picture his face today. So the history of it, because they want you to understand this field, the backstory. Or, I'm in town, I'm looking for a medical doctor, right? I can guarantee you the first thing after they get my insurance card, of course, they want to get the money. The second thing they're going to do with me is fill out this form, Mr. Hughes, and tell us about your medical history. Your father had this, your mother had that, they died at what age or whatever it might be. You're having these kind of symptoms, how long you've been having these symptoms. They want to know my medical history because that's going to help them to diagnose what my issue is or is going to be later on in life. They want to know those things because they understand the value of it. We understand the value of history and everything else, in other words. But when it comes to this kind of stuff, we're like, let's not talk about the history, because we don't want to talk about it. But we have to. We need
7
to.
minutes.
We must. Thank you very much. We must talk about it. And the thing about it is this. This is where it's all intertwined. See, I can't, as a Black man, I can't talk about my history without talking about white folks' history, because they tied up together. So I can't not talk about it, because surely you're not telling me don't talk about my folks, talk about my ancestors, talk about my people. I mean, I love them. I got to talk about them. Even their lives were tough and difficult and hard and tragic and horrific even sometimes. But when I do that, I'm going to talk about the country. When I talk about the country, I'm going to talk about all of us in this country. So it's all intertwined and critical that we understand the backstory and the history of things. And it takes effort to discover what's been hidden. That's why it's called hidden. Yeah, hidden means you're not supposed to be able to find it. We went through some work to hide it, so we got to go through some work to find it now. So it's going to take some work to be able to do this. And of course, it is uncomfortable. Um, I mean, I read the hard stuff, and not as much as I used to, because I have a harder time reading it, to be honest with you. Older I get, the harder it is to read the hard stuff. But I gotta read it. I gotta know. I gotta understand because I've got to be able to talk about it. I've got to be able to put it in a context. I've got to realize some things. So it is uncomfortable. Conversations are uncomfortable. But nobody dies from these things. Obviously, there's one in a million nuts out there that kill somebody over this, but we're not going to run into those folks. So the reality is, the folks that we know, we can talk about it, engage about it, study about it, and nobody will die. I promise you. Don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. Matter of fact, you're going to be relieved. Find out, hey, I can do that. I can talk about that stuff. That ain't too bad. It is something I've been wanting to talk about that. But ultimately, it's got to become up close and personal for us. That's when things change. You know, I remember reading in the paper years ago, and I'm sure it's been done a million times, but there was one occasion, maybe it's hometown or something, um, where some young kid had died in a car accident driving too fast late at night. Maybe he was drinking, I don't know. And that was on the east side of town, maybe. And on the west side of town, this father who's got a son about the same age, he takes his son to that boy's funeral. Now, they don't know him, they don't know his family, they don't know anything about it. He just read about it in the paper and that they were having a funeral. He took his son to that funeral and he made his son go up and look in that coffin because he wanted it to become personal and up close for his son. Because he could have told his boy, you know what happened to, William, that boy that went off the road and killed himself. So you got to be careful. The boy would have been like, yeah, 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 yeah. But once he looks in that coffin and sees somebody his age, and he sees that car, a photograph of that car wrapped around a tree, maybe it becomes personal for him that way. That's when things I think begin to change, when they become up close and personal for us. I was talking to a local artist recently, and someone was criticizing one of his buildings, and he said, "Oh, excellent! It means that viewing it produced a reaction." That's all he cared about, that it got noticed. I guess that's the way architects think. I don't know. I like people to brag about what I build, but apparently it didn't matter to this guy. He just wanted the reaction. And here's the thing about it. Think about it. Did it occur to you that before the summer of 2020, in other words, last year, the majority of our citizens walked past a huge structure called racism without reacting to it? It's been there, and it didn't get worse. It hadn't gotten worse. It's just plain old been there. But we've been walking past it, not even seeing it, not even noticing it, as if we got our eyes covered up. Then all at once, oh my goodness, there's racism. No, it's been like that for like many hundreds of years now. But we're reacting to it now. And I think one of the reasons we're reacting to it uh, is because, well, let me jump to that.
2 minutes.
George Floyd. Thank you. We didn't just see George Floyd die. We watched it. Now I'm trying to make a distinction here. You like me, you've seen many of those folks that have been killed at the hands of police, whatever it might be. But on this occasion, it wasn't you watched it, even though you didn't want to watch it, even though it made you uncomfortable. You watched it, you felt it. And you're like, I think all of us literally almost felt something on the back of our neck, thinking, oh gosh, how uncomfortable. What a terrible, I can imagine that happening to me or my son. It became personal for us, in other words. And so this is about experiencing internal conflict. I am all for internal conflict. Now, it's uncomfortable, but that's where change comes. It's when we find ourselves in uncomfortable ways and we've got to deal with something that we haven't been wanting to deal with. That's where the change will come. And it's okay to have internal conflict about race and our race problems, because we've been trying to figure it out for hundreds of years, right? So don't feel bad if you can't figure it all out, but don't feel bad because you've got an internal conflict either, because that's what it's about. It's not about feeling guilty. It's not about that. Don't feel guilty, but go through the internal conflict and allow that to be the case. Ask yourself some questions. Ask yourself these questions. Examine yourself. Look through the lens. Turn the lenses around, they're reflective lenses, and look back at you and see yourself and be honest and be comfortable, not be comfortable, but be okay with being honest. What has my culture, my life, my family taught me? How can we let 400 years pass and still be where we are today? We've got to ask these questions. And if you really want to do some of the work, start reading. I was talking about the hard stuff. This is some of the hard stuff. And I'd be glad to send this list. And I love books. I listen to books. I read books, Kindle, hardback, hardcover, paperback, whatever it might be. Reading has been my way in understanding this. But I encourage us to read the hard stuff or listen to it on Audible or whatever it might be. But you don't have to listen to all of it, but listen to it. Take one at least hard read and work your way through it. I think you'll be glad that you did it. So I encourage us to not give up. We're not where we should be, not where we ought to be, but we're going somewhere and we'll get there together. I'm confident and certain of that. So thank you for giving me a few moments of your time to talk about something that's terribly uncomfortable, but we did it. At least I talked. Nobody died, and we got some thoughts to think about. I know every time I do it, I will think about it again. I'll redo this presentation because I should have said this, should have this. I think more deeply about it. So let's continue to think, continue to work. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hughes. We really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm going to see if I can you stop me from sharing or do I need to do that? Obviously, I lack the gift.
I need to see.
Oh, here. Oh, no, that's not it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hughes.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me today. I greatly appreciate it. I'm just going to log out probably.